Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 130 called The Rise and Fall of Byzantium. In the century from 860 to 960, Byzantium was reborn as the greatest power in Western Eurasia. Its armies were invincible, spearheaded by regiments of heavy cavalry which terrified its opponents. And in this podcast episode, I want to look at how Byzantium achieved this and why, in my view, in its hour of triumph, it lay the foundations for its fall in the 11th century. So let's start where we left off in the last episode with the Emperor Basil I's reign. As I recounted, this peasant from Macedonia established the so-called Macedonian dynasty, which has become synonymous with Byzantine success. I described his blood-soaked rise to power, in which he literally murdered his way to the top, assassinating his benefactor, the Emperor Michael III, when he lay unconscious in a drunken stupor. But his path to power was more exciting than his reign. When he became emperor in 867, he seemed determined to show himself the opposite of his former life. He behaved with studied religiosity, dedicating his crown to Christ and displaying ostentatious piety until his death. His most lasting legacy was a reform of Justinian's famous legal code, which came to be called the Basilica and was used as the main Byzantine compendium of law until the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1453. It's ironic, I think, that he's credited with this achievement since he was probably largely illiterate. Historians think the brains behind it was actually Michael III's uncle Caesar Bardus, who Basil had murdered. History, as they say, is written by the victors. On the battlefield, his achievements were not spectacular. One of his generals subjugated a breakaway Christian sect called the Paulicians, located on the upper Euphrates, who had sided with the Arabs against Byzantium. Another general worked with the Carolingian king of Italy, Louis II, with whom Basil had formed an alliance to drive the Arabs out of Bari in southern Italy. Byzantine armies also occupied Taranto and most of Calabria, making southern Italy into a Byzantine stronghold, which would last until the Normans pushed them out 200 years later in 1071. But things didn't go so well in Sicily, where the Arabs took Syracuse in 878. Basil died in 886 after a hunting accident when his belt was allegedly caught on the antlers of a deer, which dragged him for miles in woodland. He was succeeded by his son Leo VI, nicknamed the Wise on account of his love of books. Indeed, Leo was the complete opposite of his legal father Basil. I say legal because most historians think his biological father was Michael III, who, you will recall from the last episode, had an unusual three-way affair between him, his mistress Eudokia Ingarina, and Basil. Forbidden by the church to marry Eudokia, he got Basil to marry her instead while he continued his affair. This meant that while Eudokia bore Basil 6 legal children, historians think Michael fathered the first of these, who was Leo. Certainly, Basil seems to have been of this opinion, since he treated Leo brutally, frequently beating him. Leo also seems to have believed it, since the moment Basil was dead, he reburied Michael III with impressive ceremony in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. The complete opposite of Basil, Leo was bookish and sincere, and according to the lively and possibly fanciful stories told by our most entertaining chronicler of this age, Liutprand of Cremona, he would disguise himself to walk illegally on the streets of Constantinople late at night after the curfew, saying he was in search of a brothel to test the honesty of the night watch. One night he bribed 2 sets of watchmen, but was arrested and beaten by the third. The next morning he punished those who'd let him go, but rewarded the guards who'd beaten him. Liutprand is keen to praise him as a man of virtue, but in reality he was a fairly ineffectual ruler. The major event of his reign was the Bulgar Khagan Simeon I's victory over a Byzantine army at Bulgariphagon in 896, which was a serious setback in the Balkans and forced the empire into a tributary position. Arab raiders from Tripoli inflicted another humiliation in 904 when they sacked Thessalonica, the empire's second city after Constantinople. Leo had a string of marriages which made him unpopular with the church, who regarded more than one marriage as immoral. After 28 years of uninspiring leadership, he died in 912, leaving a young son aged 7, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, who was as bookish as his father and is best known for compiling the works of ancient Roman writers, helping them to survive to this day, as well as insisting on being called Porphyrogenitus, meaning born in the purple, or more accurately born in the room called the Porphyra, which was lined with purple porphyry marble and reserved for empresses to give birth. He was keen to emphasize his legitimacy, since his mother was not in fact the empress when she gave birth to him, but the emperor's mistress, although she was allowed to give birth in the Porphyra. Regents dominated the first half of his reign. First, the regency of his mother Zoe, who was made empress after his birth, and who ruled the empire until 919. It was a bad time for the empire, and the Bulgar Khagan Simeon inflicted yet another devastating defeat on the Byzantines at Achelous in 917, giving Bulgaria undisputed control of the Balkans. This prompted a revolt in 920 against Zoe when a usurper named Romanus Lecapenus, head of the imperial guard and a former favourite of the Emperor Basil I, ousted both Zoe and a prominent general Leo Phocas, who also tried to seize power. Romanus's reign as co-emperor with Constantine VII marked the beginning of Byzantium's astonishing rise to power. In 24 years, from 920 to 944, he stabilised the empire's deteriorating situation in the Balkans and created the platform for the army's resurgence. First, he dealt with the growing problem of Bulgar power by negotiating a marriage alliance with the Bulgar Khagan's son Peter with his own granddaughter Maria, who was marketable since she'd been born into the purple. This was an enormous concession to the Bulgars, and Romanus followed it up by recognising the Bulgar Khagan as emperor. Fortunately for the Byzantines, it paid off. Maria played her part well, and the marriage was a success when she gave birth to several children, including 2 future Bulgar emperors, Boris II and Roman. By doing this, she facilitated a much-needed peace between the 2 states, which lasted for the next 40 years. Romanus's other achievement was to appoint John Quercas, commander of the field armies in the east. A brilliant Cappadocian general, he quickly led these armies to spectacular victories over the fragmented Arab emirates in the Levant. In 934 he captured Melitene and expelled the Muslim inhabitants who refused to convert to Christianity. In 941, the Rus Principality of Kiev distracted him by attacking Constantinople with a fleet of warships which appeared out of nowhere in the Sea of Marmara. They were only just beaten off with Greek fire. Quercas rushed his army back to defend the capital and defeated a Rus landing in Bithynia. The next year, he was back on the Eastern Front, directing his increasingly confident army against the Arab strongholds in Upper Mesopotamia, taking Amida and other towns. His primary target was Edessa, which housed the Mandylion, a famous icon believed to be a piece of cloth on which Christ had wiped his face, miraculously imprinting an image of his features. It had played a crucial part in the icon controversy, since it was one of the most prestigious icons to escape iconoclastic destruction. Qurkas besieged Edessa, and in 944 its emir capitulated and became a Byzantine vassal, handing the Mandylion to Qurkas, who took it triumphantly back to Constantinople. There followed a lull in the Byzantine counteroffensive against Islam when Romanus Lecapenus was overthrown by his own sons, who feared their father would disinherit them and crown Constantine Porphyrogenitus as sole emperor in penance for his having seized the throne. The coup backfired, and Constantine ousted both father and sons, although they were all exiled rather than executed. Qurkas was a victim of the coup since he was a supporter of Romanus Lecapenus, and he was replaced by Bardas Phokas, another capable Cappadocian general who tried but failed to recapture Crete. The turning point for Byzantium came in 955 when Bardas Phocas's son Nicephorus Phocas was appointed commander of the eastern armies. During the next 20 years, the Byzantine army became the best fighting force in western Eurasia, driving all the empire's enemies before it and reconquering some important parts of what the Arabs had seized from Byzantium over the past centuries. First, he defeated the Hamdanid emir of Aleppo, Saif al-Dawla, who'd become the major Arab leader in the Levant, taking Adarta in 957. Then, in 960, he turned his attention to Crete and led an enormous force there, reputedly comprising 50,000 troops, 27,000 oarsmen and marines, and 308 ships. It was the largest military expedition fielded by the Byzantines since the days of Justinian and Belisarius. Landing at Almiros, Nicephorus defeated the Cretan Emirates army and marched on Chandax, the Arabic name for Heraklion, the capital of the island both then and today. The siege was hard fought, but in March 961 the town fell, and later that year Nicephorus completed the conquest of the island. The recapture of Crete was a pivotal moment for the Byzantines. It reminds me of Belisarius's recapture of Carthage, which had been a turning point in Justinian's reign. Arab control of Crete had been a thorn in Byzantium's side for over a century, exposing the Aegean to Arab piracy. Its recapture restored security and prosperity in Constantinople's backyard. Now there was no stopping Nicephorus. In 962 he took the army back to Syria, where he took Hierapolis and routed Saif al-Dawla before advancing on Aleppo. On the 24th of December he took control of the town, the most important Arab stronghold in the region after Antioch. It was probably at this time he earned the nickname the White Death of the Saracens. His next step was to seize the imperial throne. This happened in 963 when Romanos II, Constantine VII's son and emperor since his death in 959, died unexpectedly at the age of 25 of unknown causes. His wife, Theophano, became regent for their two sons, Basil II and Constantine VIII, both of whom had already been crowned co-emperors, although at the time of their father's death they were only 5 and 3 respectively. Theophano felt threatened by a court eunuch, Joseph Bringas, who suggested he become the regent for the boys. But the army based in Caesarea in Anatolia wasn't having any of it and proclaimed Nicephorus emperor. Theophano didn't object. Nicephorus dispatched a courier to Constantinople saying he was on his way to be acclaimed co-emperor with the boys. He appointed his second-in-command, John Zimisces, as commander of the eastern armies. Bringas locked down the city and tried to take over, but its inhabitants rioted and forced him to flee. On August the 16th, 963, Nicephorus arrived in the capital and was proclaimed co-emperor. Since he wasn't married, he asked Theophano to marry him. She agreed, although, as we'll hear, the marriage was not a happy one. We have a famous description of Nicephorus as emperor from the pen of Ludbrand of Cremona, who was serving as Otto the Great's emissary at the Byzantine court. Ludbrand was a gifted and satirical writer who particularly resented Nicephorus's arrogance towards the German king and emperor when he insisted on calling him king, not emperor. His description of Nicephorus borders on the farcical. Quote, "He is a quite monstrous man, dwarfish, with a fat head, and mole-like by virtue of the smallness of his eyes, whom you would not like to run into in the middle of the night." End quote. It wasn't a flattering description of the best general Byzantium had had since the days of Leo III and Constantine V. But no matter what his appearance was like, the victories kept coming. In 964, he returned to the Eastern Front and continued his offensive into Syria. City after city fell: Tarsus, Emesa, Larissa, Martyropolis, and many more. Finally, in October 968, he began the siege of Antioch. This had been the third city of the Roman Empire and was still home to a substantial Christian population. After a long siege, on the 28th of October 969, the city was stormed. As with Crete, Antioch's capture was transformational for Byzantium. It gave it dominance in Syria. But in less than a month, Nicephorus was dead, stabbed to death by his deputy, John Tzimiskes, in league with Nicephorus's wife Theophano. The story goes that, unknown to Nicephorus, the two were having an affair. Tzimiskes is described by chroniclers as a dashing soldier with blonde hair and irresistible to women. He was also one of Nicephorus's staunchest supporters and had marched with him to Constantinople in 965 and been rewarded with the office of domestic, meaning senior commander, of the elite tagmatic regiment, the Scolae. We don't know the details, but the two men then fell out badly, and by 969 Tzimiskes had been dismissed from his post. Maybe Nicephorus had discovered his affair with his wife. Whatever the truth, on the night of the 11th of December 969, Theophano got up in the middle of the night, leaving her husband snoring in bed. She unlocked the door of the imperial bedchamber and led in Tzimiskes with his accomplices, who stabbed Nicephorus to death. There was surprisingly little opposition to Tzimiskes' elevation to emperor. For reasons that I'll examine in a moment, the people of Constantinople had started to resent the best soldier emperor they'd had for over 2 centuries. Tzimiskes married a daughter of Constantine VII to gain legitimacy, while presumably continuing his affair with Theophano. Like Nicephorus, he was a soldier, and no happier than on the battlefield. In his short reign, he continued the Byzantines' march into the Levant. He was distracted when the Rus Grand Prince, Sviatoslav, led his forces across the Danube and conquered much of Bulgaria, but he achieved one of the Byzantine army's greatest victories over these Rus Vikings at the Battle of Dorostolon in 971, using brilliantly executed textbook manoeuvres of heavy cavalry and infantry. He completely routed the Rus Viking army. It was a victory over the dreaded Vikings the English and Franks could only have dreamt of. Like Nicephorus, his primary focus was on the Eastern Front. In 973, our chroniclers say he was even considering an advance on Baghdad itself. But instead, he led his army into Syria and northern Palestine. The cities along the northern Levantine coast fell one by one: Baalbek, Sahun, Buzair, and finally Beirut. Now Jerusalem itself was only a few days' march away. It looked as if the Roman Empire was about to be restored. But that was not to be. In the autumn of 975, he returned to Constantinople to prepare for the next year's campaign in Syria. It never took place. On the 10th of January 976, he lay dead. We don't know the cause. One source suggests it was a spiteful palace eunuch who poisoned him. This is possible since the success of Byzantium's soldier emperors was resented by many in the capital. And it's to that subject I now want to turn, since the rise of this new military aristocracy created a crisis in the empire. Let's go back to the beginning and ask, who exactly were they? Well, they included principally the Cappadocian families, such as the Phocas, Ducas, Skleros, Diogenes, and others. John Zimisces was Armenian, and Armenia was another source of military manpower, especially infantry. Some historians have compared them with the feudal barons ruling France at this time, suggesting there was a similar rise in feudalism in Byzantium. But I think this is quite wrong, since the army was still centrally paid. In contrast, the feudal lords in France maintained their own armies independently of the Carolingian and Capetian kings. However, Byzantium was still a highly centralized state, enjoying its Roman legacy of a centralized tax system and army. In my view, the Cappadocian generals were more like the Prussian Junker class in 19th century Germany, who were landed aristocrats in control of the Prussian army. Another comparison might be made with Illyria in the late Roman Empire, which was the recruiting ground for the Roman army and produced the soldier emperors such as Claudius Gothicus, Aurelian, and Diocletian. The Cappadocians were excellent soldiers who liked nothing better than training and leading their men into battle. We have a vivid description of Nicephorus Phocas drilling his men, left to us by the chronicler Leo the Deacon. Quote, "He, Nicephorus, trained his men in the conduct of war. He sharpened their mettle and toughened them with daily exercises. He drilled them in complex manoeuvres, commanding them to sound trumpets, beat drums, and clash cymbals, then to leap upon their horses, shoot with bows at the target, and hurl their spears straight at the mark. Nothing about the art of war escaped his notice." End quote. The Byzantine army had become the best fighting force in Western Eurasia. In my view, it resembled the Justinianic armies Belisarius had led to victory. Generals like John Quercus and Nicephorus Phocas reintroduced formations from Justinianic days, such as armoured cataphracts and horse archers. A 10th century Arab source provides us with an excellent description of these terrifying soldiers. Quote, "They, i.e. the Byzantine horsemen, advanced on horses who seemed to have no legs, i.e. they were wearing long armoured coats, and whose helmets and garments were of iron like their swords." End quote. And it wasn't just the horsemen who changed. We know from the military manuals written at this time, such as the Praecepta Militaria, allegedly written by Nicephorus Phocas himself, and the Tactica, written later by Nicephorus Uranus, that the Byzantine infantry were also highly disciplined and trained to fight in new formations like squares. Emphasis was placed on recruiting Armenians, who were tough soldiers like the 3rd century Roman Illyrians had been. Therefore, in my view, Byzantium's success in the 10th century came not from the so-called Macedonian emperors, i.e. the descendants of the Macedonian peasant Basil, but from this new Cappadocian officer class. This had caused antagonism between the two as early as the reign of Romanus Lecapenus, when he had issued legislation protecting peasant holdings from being bought up by the great landowners. Yet it was the Cappadocians who won when Constantinople accepted Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces as emperors, albeit acting as regents for the legitimate heir to the throne, the boy Basil II. But everything changed after Zimisces' death in 976, when Basil was 18 years old and wanted to rule as sole emperor, helped by the fact his brother Constantine VIII decided to step down. This created a crisis in the empire. Basil would almost certainly have been overthrown by John Zimisces' successor, Bardas Skleros, another highly regarded Cappadocian general, were it not for the wily political machinations of a eunuch first minister, also called Basil and referred to in our sources as the Parakomimenos, or Lord Chamberlain, to distinguish him from the emperor. Between the two of them, they fomented dissent between the generals by using John Zimisces' murder of Nicephorus Phocas as the reason to divide them into two factions, those pro-Zimisces and those pro-Phocas, who were led by Bardas Phocas, the cousin of the murdered Nicephorus Phocas. In 979, Bardas Phocas defeated Bardas Skleros twice, first near Amorium and then at a spa town called Basilica Therma. The spa waters ran red with Byzantine blood. Bardas Skleros fled to Baghdad. But Basil II still had to deal with the ambitions of Bardas Phocas. According to the chronicler Michael Psellus, he heeded the advice the defeated Bardas Skleros later gave him to, quote, cut down the governors who become overproud. Let no generals on campaign have too many resources, end quote. When Basil tried to reduce the Cappadocian army, Bardas Phocas rebelled. Basil resorted to a strategy that would, in my opinion, prove the undoing of Byzantium. He appealed to the Rus prince of Kiev, Vladimir, for help. He offered his sister in marriage in return for an army of 6,000 Rus Viking warriors. This force became the famous Varangian Guard of Vikings and later Saxons when they fled Norman England after 1066, who became Byzantium's stormtroopers, replacing Nicephorus's dreaded cataphracts. With these and the Byzantine armies in the Balkans who stayed loyal to him, Basil defeated Bardas Phocas at the Battle of Abydos in 989. The problem with Basil II's strategy of self-preservation was that by crushing the military aristocracy and replacing the Cappadocian regiments such as the cataphracts with foreign mercenaries like the Varangian Guard, he ripped the heart out of the Byzantine army. It was, I think, very similar to what Theodosius I did to the late Roman army in the late 4th century AD, when he replaced the legions with Gothic mercenaries, who then went on to sack Rome. Another comparison is with the Abbasid caliphs, who replaced the Arab armies with Turkish mercenaries, who came to control the caliphs and caused the caliphate to disintegrate. The lesson is never outsource your army. While Basil II is famous for being a successful general nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer for his subjugation of the Bulgarian Empire in the rest of his reign, historians have shown much of this reputation was in fact a later invention. His army was in fact nothing like the one which Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces had led. It was much smaller. It didn't include the excellent Cappadocian regiments who now lay dead on the Anatolian battlefields. Its horsemen and infantry were low grade compared with the Cappadocians. The Varangian Guard instead spearheaded the campaigns. That was why the Bulgarian War, in my opinion, lasted 30 years. In contrast, Nicephorus Phocas's wars were lightning-fast victories. Only 46 years after Basil II's death in 1071, the enfeebled Byzantine army was routed by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert. Byzantium never recovered. Cappadocia and Armenia, the heartland of Nicephorus Phocas's armies, were lost forever. Byzantium became a minor regional power, rescued, in my opinion, by the First Crusade from annihilation. And yet, there had been a moment in the reigns of Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces when it looked as if Byzantium had a golden opportunity to turn the tables on Islam. Jerusalem, Syria, and who knows, perhaps Egypt as well, were waiting to be reconquered. But the Macedonian emperors squandered this opportunity as they sought to save themselves from the new military aristocracy. Basil II's reign marked not the apogee of Byzantium, but the start of its fall. And that ends this episode. And now I've got a major announcement to make about this podcast. I'm changing its name from The Fall of the Roman Empire to History Unlocked. Why? Because this podcast has moved beyond the fall of Rome to cover a broader range of historical topics. As you know, in the last 20 episodes, we've covered Charlemagne, the Arab Caliphates, and Byzantium. I kept the name The Fall of the Roman Empire because I thought these entities were strongly influenced by Rome, and my next book about them will be called The Inheritors of Rome. But going forward, I'm moving into new areas and intending to cover a broad range of historical topics, from the Crusades to feudalism, from the Seljuk Turks to the later history of Byzantium, and from the Mongols to the history of Islam, and covering great figures in history like Saladin, Richard the Lionheart, Genghis Khan, and much more. So I'm going to launch it probably in May this year, and the most important thing is you don't need to do a thing except tune in to the same show, sit back and listen to great stories from history. In the meantime, do check out my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, where you can get a free ebook and send me any questions or messages. Thanks for your time, and talk to you soon.